Hello again. Welcome to the Doomer Optimism podcast. Today we have Evan Barker of Narrative 4. He's a friend of ours, friend of the podcast, and it's exciting to finally get him on. He's been involved with other things associated with Doomer Optimism. And I think, Evan, you have I think, a constructive approach to a lot of what we talk about on Doomer Optimism, which is reaching across difference, particularly because we think that the existential challenges are so great that we have to, in some sense, we have to work through our differences and build communities together to weather the world that's coming. And I think that your approach to doing this is particularly interesting. And this is your work, this is your profession. Do you want to introduce yourself and talk about what you're doing with Narrative 4 and just take as long as you need?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me on. It's been, yeah, a long, as you said, a long journey for us to get here. But I'm glad because in the various times that we've delayed recording for various reasons that are, as you said earlier, comical at this point. I've caught different episodes with people like Jim Rutt and other episodes that have been aired since we first started talking, and
Yeah.
those have actually informed my thinking on topics that are like it's still evolving, and the way I talk about my work is changing every day. And so now I have new stuff to think about. So the delay is never bad as long as something good comes out of it.
Yeah.
So I found my way to Doomer Optimism around the same time as I found this job, and all of that kind of happened during the pandemic. So there's this is a little bit of like a kind of a landing place for me because I've been orbiting some of these topics like sustainability and self-sufficiency and resiliency, agriculture, cottage industry, for a long time. And then at the same time finding that there was a sort of like homestead Twitter, and that's kind of where I found Doomer Optimism, and then realizing that there was kind of like a social, cultural, political aspect to Doomer Optimism that I found just as compelling as like learning how to can stuff. And that kind of kept me coming back. But all the while, I was working in the education field and doing narrative storytelling with mostly teenagers, but also adults. So I guess my Doomer Optimism background is that I grew up in suburbia, and I moved as a teenager from the Northeast to the South, and began working in like horticulture and gardening and stuff because everybody in my family had always grown food and all my neighbors had grown food. So like I was raised in a kind of suburbia where like, the old Italian guy next door grew garlic, and like everybody had their own cool tomatoes and stuff. And so that was something I remember since I was very, very young. And I didn't think of it as like, preparing for any kind of disaster or anything. It was just the done thing that you grew food, you shared it with your neighbors. A lot of our social gatherings were based around big meals and what people had growing at the time. And so that's how I grew up. And then becoming a homeowner and having some space to play with and like deciding how big of a garden I could grow, led me to dabbling in, marketing and gardening. And so I had a side hustle of growing food and selling it at a market, in an urban garden for a while. And then that led me to know a really great tribe of people locally to me that I wouldn't have known if we hadn't all been market vendors together. Um, and the different skills and different hobbies and interests that that group brought together really broadened my horizons. That like I have this little tribe of people who all live 10 or 15 minutes apart, that everybody does something a little bit related but different about their food. And then at the same time, I was finding Doomer Optimism, and I was a high school teacher, and then this opportunity came up for me to join Narrative 4. So then I made a professional shift at the same time. Um, and I went from being a language arts teacher in a local high school in the Upper South to basically being, I have the same job title as Michael Scott. I'm a regional manager for Narrative 4.
Yeah. Who's your assistant to the regional manager? Not assistant regional manager, assistant to the regional manager.
It depends on which cat's hanging out in the office that day.
Okay. Okay. Uh-huh. Got it. Got it.
Yeah, no, so it's I'm like, quote unquote middle management, but I have very few direct reports. It's kind of like me, for the most part in my neck of the woods, it's like me out here hustling to work with different people locally, which is really important to me. Like I should be managing people and sending them out to do this work, but I'm compelled to do it personally because that's the way I know how to do it best.
Mhm.
Well, yesterday I was in Louisville, Kentucky, working with some pre-service teachers, and before that, I was in a smaller town in rural southeastern Kentucky, working with community members in a library, and those things are happening 24 hours apart. Um, so I'm really fortunate to get to do what I do. So I guess I should introduce Narrative Four in and of itself. So it's a global literary and education nonprofit with a local focus. So we use a method called the story exchange to get people to humanize each other and to understand each other a little bit, and to use storytelling to access all kinds of knowledge. I would say that empathy is probably the biggest part of what we do, but we also say that compassion is where empathy meets action. And it's important to bracket that empathy doesn't mean that you have to like or agree with people. It just means that you have to see them as equally human, and that you have to maybe accept that other people have a truth that's theirs and it may not correspond to your truth, but you're all still inhabiting the earth together. So at some level, you have to figure stuff out.
Yeah.
And that jived really well with the doomer optimism kind of rule of like be a good neighbor to the extent that you can be a good neighbor for as many people as possible for as long as possible.
Nice. Okay. Yeah, I mean that resonates with me quite a bit. One thing that bothers me that I see especially online, and this is from all directions, from all ideologies, is the dehumanization of the political enemy. Um, and I understand that, there's lots of people doing actions that make me sick, to be frank, or I don't agree with um, what they do in the world. But to start dehumanizing people, slipping into dehumanizing language, it starts becoming to me very dangerous very quickly. And you see this, I think, both on the left and the right doing this in the other direction. Um, and it seems like in narrative four, like the whole point is to rehumanize each other from very different backgrounds, right? Even if they're still not going to agree with their lifestyle, with their political ideology, etc.
Yeah, that's a pretty good summation. The organization was founded around 11 years ago, and the question I think that sparked the founding of the actual group was a bunch of writers sitting around, and they were kind of riffing on the question of like, what is the aim of storytelling, or what is the highest aim of storytelling? And you can take this in myriad directions, and it's fun to do it. Like everybody should engage with that thought experiment because we use stories for everything. But this group of people in particular, in this particular setting, they settled on the idea that the highest aim of storytelling was to like create understanding between people. And if you extend that to, you know, basic stuff like how somebody is different from you and like what their lived experience is, all the way to like us repairing our social fabric or even knitting a new social fabric, then the point of storytelling is to transmit knowledge. It's also to transmit culture. It's to create understanding out of things that may not be related. Humans use narrative to create order. Like we see order by applying narrative to things, like cognitively. It's basically wired into our brains. And so um, many some people like if you're kind of in the Ben Shapiro facts don't care about your feelings world, you can style yourself as a super rational thinker, but in reality that's just a certain narrative frame that you're putting on the world that colors your perceptions of things. So if you kind of just lean into the fact that story explains all knowledge and all learning,
Mm-hmm.
it becomes a little bit easier to deal with.
Yeah. Okay. The concept that just rose in my mind is kind of the density of narrative relationship, and storytelling, of course, has been around, humanity probably for as long as humans in various degrees. You know, with your, in your local community, whether it's a church community or your neighbors or family, the narratives are going to be are going to be much denser, right? Much greater level of understanding just casually. Like you come over and you cook dinner together and you're telling stories, and it's not even an intentional self-aware thing. It's just kind of happening. Um, Whereas we don't really get the opportunity to do that, especially with somebody who lives in a different geographical location. Of course, that's changing a bit with the internet, but I would say that we're mostly not sharing stories with each other long distances. We're sharing, propositions, and heated propositions, oftentimes, right? And so it doesn't seem like the internet has done much to kind of say extend out the depth of narrative relationship, say beyond localities, but also within localities. People are now addicted to the internet in many cases, or for various economic reasons. You know, kids are moving away. Going off to college, leaving. Where I live, there's a lot of talk of rural gentrification, and the kids are selling off their land that their grandmothers, after their grandmother passes away and they move to the city or something. And so it seems like we're even losing the kind of local depth of narrative, and
Mm.
the the internet is not providing a replacement either locally or more broadly. And so we're kind of in a heap of trouble. Um, it sounds like this is where you guys come in to save the day.
Yeah, I mean, one hopes. I won't. I don't claim to have like the capital T the answer about stuff. But one thing that has recently been sort of rolling around in my mind is the concept of like Dunbar numbers, and I've been thinking about that in the context of the internet and the little Twitter sphere that that kind of surrounds the podcast too, and all the different personalities. So like for people who didn't catch Jim Roth's episode, the Dunbar numbers are kind of a concept by this mathematician who posited basically that based on how other primates behave, that there's a sort of number, an upper limit to the number of people you can hold in a social circle, and that all relationships require kind of personal maintenance. So, like running into somebody in the store might keep them in one of your circles, like in your Dunbar number. And the number for some people, people settle around 150. And I don't know if that's necessarily true. And I don't engage with the mathematics of it because that's not really my field. But I think the Dunbar number is a useful concept to explore this through because the what the what the Dunbar number might have applied to 10,000 years ago is that if you lived in a village with 100 people and you knew every single one of them by name and you were bound by a survival struggle, that would explain the relationships that you had in that village that would be interlocking and complex,
Yeah.
because they would all be about a shared experience and the place was small enough for you to know everybody. The
And
internet
say real
and
quick, would you say
yeah.
real quick that narrative sharing stories with each other, it actually there was a evolutionary reason for that. There was a survival reason for that because if somebody's telling a story about their experiences, like that relates to your place as well and gives you certain insights into what to do or what not to do in certain situations. And so there was an evolutionary fitness, I guess, perspective to that as well, which we've
Oh
probably
yeah, absolutely. And that that goes all the way back to probably something as simple as like, hey, don't eat that mushroom.
yeah.
Or I knew a guy who ate that mushroom and he died, and that's a rudimentary story right there. Um, and then if you extend stories into explaining more complicated phenomena, like why is there a giant glowing thing that shows up at some times and then goes away a few hours later? People come up with stories to describe all sorts of things, and there's something really beautiful and human about that. That like we need to come up with a beginning, middle, and end to describe things that are cyclical and that pre-existed us and that will post-date us too.
Hmm.
So yeah, there's something so basic. Every single culture has storytelling, and we may all do them, around different customs or with different languages and with different outcomes. But it's kind of like as basic as how people can bond over food because everybody has to eat. Period. Full stop. So the I think that the to return to the concept of the Dunbar numbers for a sec. My personal like theory about this is that stereotyping and like typecasting are an evolutionary response to knowing more people than you can know. And so the idea that you have to categorize people and sort of put them into groups, like instead of knowing 150 individuals, maybe you know 150 individuals really well, but maybe you also can keep track of like 50 or 60 stereotypes or cliques that you can neatly categorize people into. And that sort of like enables you to know, and I'm air quoting here, you can quote unquote know more people because you can stereotype them. And that might be useful in the sense that like, oh, I know that guy, he's on the football team or whatever, like that might be harmless, but it could also extend to like, oh, I know that person, they have this sticker on their truck and they're that kind of person or whatever. And so that's where it can become like, it can go from unconscious maybe categorizing people socially into if you attach a value judgment to a certain group, um, that I think that's the beginnings of dehumanization, when you begin to apply value judgment to groups of people that you can't personally know, because it's really really hard to actually hate somebody that you know personally and closely. And if people have come to the conclusion that they hate each other about an individual, there's usually a story there. But if it's just about a group, it's probably a stereotype.
Yeah. It seems like, I mean, I don't know if there's any way to avoid that. Like as you described, we do that because of cognitive, overload, basically,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's just so many relationships we keep in our mind, and yet we still are aware or run across more people than that. And and so we have to have some kind of quick and dirty heuristic to manage that. And that's kind of, we evolved that capacity and that inclination for certain reasons. So should we even be trying to change that if that's, part of our kind of evolutionary hardware, or do we need to, maybe I'm leaning too hard on this evolutionary, psychonaut, train of thought, but do we need to, implement some new software that overrides that and allows us, at least if we're not going to understand another group that we can't really interact with, at least not be so quick to place them in a derogatory category?
Yeah, a certain amount of this I don't think has choice involved. Um, I mean, there. Okay, if you want to like return with the V, like a lot of people would love to return to the village with 150 people, but that's not going to happen. Like there are 8 billion people on the earth, and that doesn't show any signs of stopping. So like so much of this is not really left up to choice. Um, and
That's the whole
if
conversation, by the way. I might just
yeah,
that these trajectories are going to maintain themselves in the future for various biophysical reasons. But go ahead.
yeah, I mean, we could fight over and that would be a really fun conversation to have, like sidebar, like we could fight over like what humans should do, kind of like as we steward the earth, but we can't even seem to really agree. Like most people can't even really agree with their next door neighbors on stuff. So like we don't really have the moral authority to make decisions for a whole species. The like all we can do is be pro-social for everybody that we can touch, whoever our orbit, whichever whoever our orbit encompasses, right? And so, if your Dunbar number includes close relationships with people who live around the world from you because of the internet, now that's giving you the ability to tap into social circles that 100 years ago you couldn't have known.
Mm,
And maybe there are people halfway around the world who are like 75% similar to you, but like 25% dissimilar. And like you might be intrigued, but also repulsed by this. And that's cool. Like if you are not threatened by that, then it just becomes something fun to learn about. But because there are 8 billion people on the world, we almost need to kind of deliberately learn how to deal with each other so that we can get to the fun and messy work of actually like making choices to help people. Because I think the tendency to we have to make decisions anyway about all sorts of things, but do we often consider their impact on fellow humans? Like maybe not.
yeah. Okay. Well, why don't we get into a little bit more of the nuts and bolts of the narrative for exchange process? Like, what actually happens? What do you do? Who's involved?
So the story exchange is the name of the process, and it actually comes out of theater, and I think I've never been a theater kid. I was more of an orc dork, but the idea of
Hey, what's an orc dork?
acting.
What's an
Oh,
orc
somebody
dork?
who plays an orchestra.
Okay, I thought it
It's
was
a
like
it's
Dungeons and Dragons thing or something.
Oh no! Oh, okay, I see. Yeah, no, it's orc with an H.
Okay.
And see, there again, I just did this unconsciously. I don't want you to think, by the way, that I'm exempting myself from any of these like dire things. Like I do all of the same shitty things that we're talking about. I just like feel real guilty about it because I grew up Catholic. Um, so We're talking about story exchange. So it's funny because I wound up just like veering into stereotype there when I described myself as a kid. But if you think about the that scene from Ferris Bueller's Day Off where the secretary is reeling off all the different stereotypes that define like a high school, jocks, dweebs, goths, all that stuff. That is a heuristic that everybody falls into, and you're conditioned to do it if you walk into a school. So anyway, a story exchange is where you create a space in a circle where you ask people to contemplate deep listening, and you ask people to show up with an episode, like a story that is an episode from their life. We don't want people to tell the whole story of their life
Mm.
for important reasons that I'll return to. And we might say something like, tell a story about a time when you met a person who changed your life, or tell a story about a time when you did something for the first time, whether that was like the first time you traveled someplace, or the first time you ate this food, or the first time you kissed a girl, or whatever. um, and there are two processes that can increase empathy, which is perspective taking, which is like, help me understand how you understand the world, and then also media. And most of us are more familiar with media than perspective taking, because perspective taking can be challenging and it kind of hurts sometimes. Like, you experience cognitive dissonance when somebody says their worldview is different from yours. Everybody does. There's a little painful thing about that that's like, oh, I don't like that because it's not the way I think about it. But most people are perfectly comfortable to watch a movie or read a book that makes them feel things, and they're feeling empathy for a character. So if you combine that with the fact that a character could be a person who you're talking with, then you can take perspective and tell narrative with a live person. And so we give people around 25 minutes, which sometimes stretches into 40 if they really get talking, to swap stories with each other in a kind of non-judgmental way. And the aim of this is, when we return to the circle, then I have to say, my name is Jason Snyder, and tell your story in the first person,
Mm.
out of my own head. And then you have to say that your name is Evan Barker. You have to tell my story. And I can't interrupt you while you're telling my story, and you can't interrupt me while I'm telling yours. And because you're not a courtroom stenographer, you can't do it verbatim. So you have to internalize the story and make it make sense for you, and then find the words to speak it out. And it will always be different from the telling to the retelling.
Yeah. Do you find at all that after people have done this with each other, that even if they have, say, different political points of view, that they're a little bit more empathetic with the kind of propositional side of their personality, or do you not even try and go there? You're just like, no, let's just, this is nice and sweet. Like, we've empathized with each other's stories. Let's just leave it at that, and not bring up the next election or something.
Um, that's a fun question, because I tell, it depends on who I'm working with, maybe like how I might set the table for that, because adults know that they're going to go back to disagreeing with each other, especially when you're working with people in like professional settings where they have to solve problems collaboratively to do their jobs.
Yeah.
So there's always a guardedness that you're kind of trying to pierce, with people being willing to share a part of themselves. And I think it's more like, when you know somebody who with whom you disagree, but you see their basic humanity, or you love them for the person they are, even though they have a view that really bothers you, it basically lets you put a little asterisk next to that person that says, like, this person has this view that I cannot stand, but I love them anyway, but I'm still going to bitterly disagree with them over this point, if you're talking politics.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Do you want to give an example or two of, a particular exchange between two people that you found particularly, I don't know, heartwarming or insightful or successful? And maybe,
Sure.
one or two that you found that just flopped, or it's just, it wasn't trying to it wasn't accomplishing what you were hoping for.
Um, Yeah, there have been so many story exchanges, and we have like an org Slack channel where people share stuff that they heard in the field. And I should say too that there's a presumption of confidentiality where we say that the stories stay in the circle, but the lessons leave. And so, like, if I explicitly give permission for my story to be shared, then I don't mind if it gets out in the breeze. But we basically ask people to, we don't call it a safe space. We're asking people to create a brave space, because oftentimes they share something that's, personal to them that could be used against them. And we find that most people kind of, they actually like decline to weaponize people's stories against them. Like there's something sacred about what happens in the circle. One of the most interesting exchanges I've ever been around was between a group of students from Eastern Kentucky with kids at a cultural center in Palestine. And so you're hearing like a 16-year-old Palestinian girl sharing the story from a boy from Eastern Kentucky who's describing going out with his grandfather and taking his first deer. And in here in Appalachia, like a rifle is as normal of a thing to see out in the world as like a toolkit. But if you're a Palestinian teenager, picking up a gun means something completely different to you. And so to see the wheels turning in these people's heads as they sort of had to contemplate like a symbol and
Yeah.
then taking a symbol out of its context and considering it through the lens of feeding your family, not like doing violence to humans, whether for defense or offense, right? Like there's no value judgment there. And so you can watch people kind of like get their brains broken by when they have to take someone else's symbols and symbolic meaning and emotional attachments to their stories and sort of filter it through their own experience because they have to balance doing fidelity to the person's story and telling it to do justice to their partner, but it also still has to make sense to them.
Yeah. Okay, so that's one example. What's an example of where it was kind of like, oh, we didn't really pull this one off, or maybe we need to tweak this methodology here.
Um, we there's a lot of like safeguards that go into the practice that there's a reason that a full story exchange can take like 2 or more hours because you're really deliberately asking people to kind of like consciously undress metaphorically in front of people. And depending on how charitable people are willing to be, the process can go really well or it can be it can be uncomfortable. One that the public can see is there's a documentary called Guns and Empathy that New York Magazine filmed, and that involved the parents of young victims of gun violence, like children, in a story exchange with gun rights activists or self-proclaimed gun rights activists, people who are not shy about loving guns. And you can imagine like it's hard to imagine two perspectives that are going to be like more fundamentally sundered. And like that's one where I think you can see the limits being tested and found and maybe exceeded. Um, but people still left that exchange feeling like they understood something about somebody else. They just had a fundamental values conflict that they couldn't necessarily square. But they all see each other as people. I think they're just still seeing each other as people from across a gulf.
Okay. Okay. So how do you choose the participants in these exchanges? Like, do you sit around and be like, okay, there's some real flashpoints in the society. Let's get somebody from, you know, uh, opposite sides of these two flashpoints or potential flashpoints, and we want them to empathize with each other. Like, are you guys like social engineers, and you're like figuring out where, where all the tears in the fabric of society are, and we're like, okay, we're gonna stitch it this way, and then we're gonna stitch it that way, and then this other way. How do you figure that out?
No, we're like explicitly non-aligned. So like although like I may present as like a bleeding heart hippie or whatever, and that's fine. Like I place that label on myself. I'm comfortable working in basically any space that I can wander into in the South. I'm happy to be here. We don't explicitly look for a particular outcome with story exchanges because if we're meddling in somebody's community, I wouldn't say meddling. If we're tinkering in someone's community, we're attempting to create a situation where they can talk about stuff, but the conversations that go on the other end of the story exchange, it's a rare situation in academia where you begin not quite knowing what the end is. It is an experiment. Um, we don't go into a story exchange thinking, well, if we add 4 people from this group and 4 people from this group and a dash of this or that, that we're going to get a certain formula because people always defy your expectations that way. So there is no expectation. I tell people that the empathetic exchange of story is a prerequisite for building community, but what you do with it is your responsibility. So if I can go into a setting where people are maybe a little bit guarded around each other and get them to humanize each other a little bit, when they get back to their regular day jobs of having to work together, at the very least, if they're going to have a disagreement, it'll be like, I'm going to disagree, but you're still a person and I see you.
Mhm.
But you're disagreeing with somebody with their humanity in mind because you want what's good for everybody. You're not disagreeing because you want to win. And if I were to pick people from different political groups and put them in a setting on purpose, it's almost like the team sport aspect of it becomes inescapable. So I would not intentionally make, like young Republicans and young Democrats get in a circle unless we explicitly said we're not talking electoral politics. Because something about that short circuits people's brains.
Yeah. Okay.
Like
Okay.
we would use a really low stakes conversation topic to try to get people to hear each other. Like my favorite one in the high school classroom was food.
Mm.
Um, and you can take food all the way through food production and politics and resources and scarcity, and that eventually can end in like war, right? Like it's not hard to go from the topic of who's got food all the way to warfare, but with most people it can just be like, what do you like to eat, and how do you create community around the table. And it's hard to disagree with somebody too stridently when you're breaking bread, unless it's Thanksgiving and they're your like Facebook uncle.
Right. Okay. Okay. So let's broaden out here a bit. So how do you think about the work you're doing with narrative exchange and just kind of this principle of rehumanizing each other in general through stories? How do you see that with the backdrop of, or actually, let me ask first, what is your diagnosis of kind of like the macro scale trends of society? In which ways are you a doomer? In other words, and how do you see narrative four as being part of the optimism, if indeed you do?
Oof. Man, that both parts of that question are enormous.
Yeah. Well,
I
we've
should have
got time,
seen
so take
I
your
should
time.
have seen that coming, but
Put your feet up. Put your feet up. Relax.
yeah, I'll have to put another pot of coffee on. Okay, so the dooming comes easily to me actually. Like I may kind of present as being cheerful and optimistic, but like it is very difficult to see, especially on the internet where people are behind a screen. It's really hard to see people being charitable to each other because it's kind of like in bad social situations or like in situations of scarcity or deprivation, people's worst instincts come out. And I think because there's such a lack of humanity on the internet, the easiest thing to do is to go on Twitter and see a bunch of like little avatars, and just your capacity to understand all those people is zero unless you know them personally, unless you know them in circles and you know them in context together, unless you're all in a group chat together, and even then it's difficult. Um, the easiest thing in the world is to fall back into defense and stereotyping and figuring out where you stand in relation to other people and then viciously defending your turf, whatever that turf is. And so, like, the social atomization is, I think, the biggest aspect of doom because it's hard enough that we have 8 billion people and we have resource scarcity and like natural limits and constraints on like what humans can expect to get out of the earth and how long we can keep the whole thing running. Like that's a big enough problem by itself. But if we can't even really agree on like whether some people should get to have food or whether they get to own their own land or any of those other questions, then there's really no hope for us like as a species. So I think this is like a species level crisis of, if we can't deal with each other, we literally have no hope. Because in nature, members of a species just starve, and that's just how it goes. Now, they also fight. So, unless we want to see ourselves as being purely animals and just fighting over resources and like might makes right, I think that's a really dark path. And I think humans have already tried it. And there's really no going back because we've already seen where that goes. Um,
But
you
now we
know, in
have,
the
but now we have, bioweapons and nuclear weapons and drones and, um, you know, meme warfare and everything else.
Yeah, we have the ability. Well, we have the ability to not only use the internet as like a weapon of mass alienation, right? Like propaganda works in insidious ways, right? The best propaganda is the kind that you don't even know you're consuming. So, like, if it's possible to dehumanize giant swaths of people and not really know that you're doing it, then that's actually like that's the sneakiest kind. And then, of course, because of technological advances, we have the ability to deal death to our fellows in like a scale that like would have been incomprehensible 100 years ago. Um, in mentioning things like, actual physical weapons or just like social ones of like writing off entire groups of people. So that's the problem. Um, the where I think the solution is that, okay, the internet's given us the ability to talk to people from around the world. And when you do find out that you have something in common with somebody that outwardly you share no similarities, the kind of impenetrable wall of gloom gets broken a little bit. And if you think, well, gosh, I have something in common with this guy who's got goats on a hillside halfway around the world. I wonder what else we could get along about. And it's not that it's all going to be puppies and rainbows and kumbaya. It's that like we should start with what is common and then build towards productive ways of resolving what isn't. And if we don't resolve it, then we can at the very least agree that these are where the fault lines are, and this is where we have to choose to disagree. And hopefully it doesn't then rise to the level of like, well, one of us has to win and one of us has to lose. But that is an inevitable consequence of disagreeing about stuff.
Yeah. Um, I can't help but bring in it's very topical, that Oliver Anthony song, and it was very polarizing, but in a kind of a strange way where I'm in a couple of group chats of different kind of milieus, and both kind of the more left oriented one mostly didn't like it for their reasons, and the more, you could say, the more right oriented one also were very divided over it. A lot of them didn't like it. They thought it was astroturf. They thought it was propaganda. They had certain issues with the messages in the song, whereas others were more favorable to it. But it seemed like both on, let's just say, the left and the right, people had certain people, had resonance, and but a lot of people had issues. But it was a mainstream, complete sensation, right? It's like one of the top songs on the charts and everything like that. So you could say the mainstream really resonated with it, but kind of the people who, you know, are kind of professional intellectuals or ideologues, picked it apart pretty savagely. What do you think about that?
Um, I have to bracket the answer by saying, seeing all those memes, I purposely have not listened to the song because I'm kind of like, okay, the when the song came out, everybody was like, oh, everybody has to listen to this, and my natural like inclination to be a contrarian little hipster shit made me be like, I'm not gonna listen to this song. I'm just gonna kind of wait. Because I want to hear it on its own merits. I don't want to hear it because everybody else is listening to it. So
Yeah.
then, but because everything moves at the speed of meme, that cycle of like, here's a new thing, is it cool or not, played out in basically like 5 days. And so it was fascinating to see now like all these different memes ricocheting around the internet from different quarters. And so I've been enjoying kind of just watching the fur fly over it, to figure out like what significance people attach to it and stuff. Um, so I couldn't give you a commentary on the work itself, but it is kind of like a macro point is about the way that people take, okay, here's a bearded guy in a t-shirt who's playing a guitar in a ostensibly country like setting. So there's like certain coding about that. But
Yeah.
then like people actually listen to the message and say, oh, this subverts my expectations. So now I have to be happy or angry about it.
Yeah.
Right. Like you can't just take it at face value. Everybody has to unpack it. And so there's then this tendency to either claim this person as like friend or foe on the basis of what symbols they're using and what sentiments they're expressing. Um, and the probably the grossest part of the internet is that it flattens out nuance. So it's friend or foe. It can't ever just be what it is. In the same way that like people have tried to relitigate like Tyler Childers lately because like, he does a music video that has a gay storyline, right? And now people are deciding like if that invalidates his entire oeuvre to them, which I just find really curious because I think there's plenty of people that I listen to and I could be like, I don't really like this one album, or I don't like this one song because it creeps me out. But do I throw out the whole person? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, in general, I'm not in favor of throwing out whole people. They're generally not my mo, with some exceptions. And that's the, at least on a place like Twitter, that's the block button. uh
Well,
that
there's a certain
that'll be it.
self-preservation aspect to that, where like if somebody's in bed, well, okay, why do you block somebody? You block someone because they're entering your experience in bad faith to try to get a rise out of you or to make you feel bad. And so as a human who needs your own self-preservation, you have a right to say, I'm fencing you off from my experience because you're here to try to make me feel bad.
Mhm.
But you know, so the song, I can't really comment to that, but what I can say is I don't know. And our co-founder Colin McCann loves that he says that the three best words in English are I don't know.
Mhm.
We try to get people to lowercase t their truths sometimes. And I think if you could get a bunch of people who had viciously different reactions to that song in a circle and not talk about that song, but talk about questions that surrounded it, you'd
Yeah,
probably find consensus building, but you would have to take the symbol or the flashpoint out of the conversation entirely in order to get there.
right. Yeah, and that's the thing is why it fascinated me was not it didn't cleave along, neat ideological lines. There was people in different ideological camps who hated it or liked it for different reasons. It was one of those kind of like perfect Rorschach test, kind of not just the song, but then just the whole production and hype around the song. It was like this perfect Rorschach test that I don't know. In some ways, I thought it was useful because it clarified some things of like you know how certain sensibilities are signaled and why people you know why people would feel threatened by it or not. It was just a fascinating episode. Yeah. Okay, so tell me more about your optimism in terms, so you said that you think that our ability to kind of work together and to understand each other is or lack thereof is probably the biggest threat, because if we can't figure that out, then we can't solve any of our larger challenges. Tell me more about kind of narrative exchange and how you see this occurring, and in particular, maybe let's bring in the notion of scale here, right? Because in Doom Optimism we talk a lot about scale.
Mhm.
There's a lot of self-identified localists or cosmo-localists. Um, you know, like, and let's talk about, again, going back to kind of our evolutionary history. We shared narratives because they were, not to be too reductionistic, but in many ways they were functional, right?
Mhm.
We had to live together. We managed to share resources together, right? Can bring in the notion of the commons, and most societies historically had various forms of the commons, et cetera. So we had to share stories in order to understand things. You know, how does this understanding each other and narrative exchange, how does it fit into kind of political economy, and how does it fit into how either you see political economy moving and how you think it probably ought to move in terms of the and this brought for us to bring in Dunbar number, and like, do we need to just recreate Dunbar numbers in a new way, uh, and and it'll evolve, reaching across more difference because we're all mutts at this point, or many of us are mutts and have many different backgrounds, or what do you think?
Hmm. So let's see. Let me try to go in reverse order. There's a lot of things to think about in that question, and I love them all. So like in reverse order, we talked about political economies and Dunbar numbers, and then the commons before that, and then the ideas of like scale. And I guess that's kind of like this, like scale and Dunbar numbers kind of bookend each other. Um, so I don't. Okay, I think the ship has sailed. I don't think we're returning to villages. Or let's put it this way: if we return to villages, it's because something Cormac McCarthy level has happened to us that put us back in villages, and I don't. I don't want to see that, and I don't think anybody in real life actually wants to see that. Even the people who claim they want to like strap up and fight their neighbors don't really want to see that. So
Can I can I
let's
can
say,
I intervene real
yeah,
quick? You
yeah.
said we're not going back to villages, but what if we interpret villages in a little bit, broader manner? I mean, to me, you can think of a tight knit neighborhood as a form of
Mhm.
village, right? Or so by village, how when I think of the term village, all I mean is uh, you know, a geographic and tightly knit set of relationships. Like that's all, and that are interacting with their immediate environment and shared resources. That's all I mean by village.
Oh, okay. And I was sloppy when I said that. So I'm sorry for that. I should have said I completely co-signed that. I guess what I meant was when people are talking about you know, return in the sense that they're going to go back to this like kind of like mythical agrarian thing that like used to exist in pre-modernity. That's the thing that I don't think is realistic, and that's fine. Like that's not, you know, if somebody wants to get 149 of their closest friends and move like way out in the sticks and raise sheep, like power to them. I do love the idea of the neighborhood as a village, and I like the idea of re-villagifying neighborhoods in urban settings. You know, that's I think that's actually a really great idea. And I think the way that you do that is people have to see a story for where they live, and they have to see themselves as characters in their neighbors' stories. So just the amount of time that you can spend fostering closeness with people who are nearby to you, regardless of differences, that is always healthy time. Um, you know, you've heard me joke about my neighbors before, but like I actually only wish them well. I just wish that they wished me the same amount of well, and like that's just something we'll all have to deal with. So there is something about the commons that relates to, which is because in America we don't really have the commons, right? Like the, most places, in fact, I think that most places have aggressively limited the commons, right? Like it's illegal to be homeless and sit on the park bench in some places, right? Because now you're a vagrant, now you're loitering, right? Like the public library is basically the last place where you can go where nobody expects you to spend money. And even that is up for grabs in some places. So like I don't think Americans culturally have a context for the commons, unless they've gone out of their way to read about it. And so we grasp at things like culture and what's nearby to us. Or like in Appalachia, people say what county they're from, you know. And if you ask that question, like, oh, what county are you from? And then what's like, what family are you in? That gives people some kind of an anchor for like their context in a place over time.
Yeah.
You can form a commons around maybe it's an identity or a culture or a practice, or it's just something that you all happen to do that's the same, whether it's a faith community or everybody living in the same holler or whatever. That's I think like that's the most beautiful thing to see is people forming commonalities and like close relationships among people nearby. So like that's a small scale. I love working for N4 because any circle of people that happen to be nearby each other will leave better than I found it as long as we just do the process.
Mm.
The big scale version of it is if I escape my little circle for a moment and engage with a circle that's halfway around the world, um, I gain like a face and a name for people who are very different from me someplace else. And I don't have to intersect their lives on the regular, but I can appreciate like who they are, where they are, what they're doing. I can see them as fully human instead of kind of like avatars, like a place on a map.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Um,
I'm not sure if that answers any of those questions. That was kind of that was a ramble. I apologize.
no, I think you answered it. I mean, so your answer is probably wise in the sense that you weren't trying to outline uh, like a very specific. This is the political economy of the future, utopian vision. You're kind of taking the approach that it's messy. We don't. At least this is my interpretation of your answer. Is it's messy. We don't really know, but what could definitely help is basically forming better relationships with each other and also empathizing with people that we would never interact with in real life. So kind of because we are going to need to, you know, reform, various forms of the commons in various ways. We are going to need to create new kinds of villages, not those, not the return version, and that includes or re-villagizing city neighborhoods. Um, is that a good summary of your political economy?
Yeah, let me take another crack at one part of it. Because I'm thinking about the villagizing thing. So I was recently fortunate to have a couple story exchanges and trainings for facilitators. So at N4 we hold story exchanges for people, but we also try to kind of evangelize like, hey, you can have stories wherever you are. So like if somebody joins a story exchange and they really resonate with it, and they say, oh, I would love to do this with people in my church or whatever, then we'll be like, okay, well, why don't you train as a facilitator so that you can thoughtfully, carefully execute this framework, because you do have to take care when you're dealing with stuff that's close to people, and we teach them how to facilitate, and then we try to be available to them so they can bounce ideas off of us or connect with another group. So there's a localism that kind of fits like little nesting dolls, where a circle can be 8 people, and it could be 8 people only in one room, right? Or it could be 800 people that have met on Zoom, which will be paired with one other individual person, but they'll still be in circles of 8, but that may be composed of people from like all geographic locales. So the circles fit like little nesting dolls. But recently, I was fortunate to go to Louisville, and I was invited by a large nonprofit that has a kind of a hub structure where they're sort of the hub of a big galaxy of other little nonprofits that do different kinds of service work for different people on the ground. And people from small nonprofits love stuff that expands their capacity. So we did a story exchange with all these people that I didn't know at all, didn't know a single person. And then we trained them on how to do this in their own context. And we always ask, well, who are you working with and who are you trying to help? And what are you hoping for them to gain from all this? And the coolest part of that was seeing people who didn't know each other say, oh, I would love it if your org would bring this to mine. And you have these kids, and I would love to bring this to them. And people were just sort of open handedly offering and sharing their resources and their skills and their knowledge with each other. And it suddenly made like Louisville feel like a big village all of a sudden, because like 20 people in a room saw 20 different ways that they could get together and try to just like help each other without expectation of reward or money or anything like that. It was just like, oh, you do this thing and I love it. And I know lots of people who will love the thing that you do, and I want them to know you.
Interesting. So, and you think that was enabled simply because they were sharing stories with each other? That suddenly
Yeah,
they
I do.
also saw how they could help each other in kind of a very functional way in terms of, you know, practical, systems with each other.
Yeah, because I don't really. I'm fond of saying, kind of like Column. I'm fond of saying I don't know. The older I get, the more I say that. I really love that, and I like going to a place where I don't know anybody, and I'll tell people on the front end, I don't know what's right for you. I don't know what's right for the people whom you serve. I don't know what's right for your city. I don't know the problems you face. I'm not showing up to pretend to be an expert on like the capital R right answer to everything. All I can do is try to create an opening in your day where you can get really close to other people who may have answers that you seek, and you may be somebody that somebody else is looking for, and you may be able to work together as members of a community. It's trying to restart that kind of exchange. And so, like one circle I recently facilitated was all women, and it just so happened that I was the facilitator, and that the group, the way the pairings shook out, it was all women in this group. And I asked a co-facilitator if I should tap out because I didn't want to like charge the space in any particular way. Like if women want to talk about stuff and they don't want men around, like that's fine. And they all said, "Oh no, you should stay. It's fine. There's like no worries." And the circle wound up being, 11 women who wound up telling these different stories that when we were done, somebody observed that all the stories had resilience at the core of them. And the coolest thing about it was if I had told them, if I had showed up in a room as the only man and told 11 women, hey, ladies, we're going to get in a circle and you're going to tell stories about resilience, it would have gone down in flames. And it should have gone down in flames because I can't tell people what part of their soul to bear. But they chose to share stories with a partner because they chose to tell what they wanted to talk about. And those stories, they've wound up forming a consensus that all of them had an aspect of resilience to them. And then the conversation that came from there was, well, look at the ways that all of our different resiliences have made us strong and capable, and look at all the help that we can give to other people because we have been strong.
Mhm.
And so I never walk into a room knowing that that's going to happen. I just get to be pleasantly surprised when it does.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, that's really cool. Let's shift gears a bit. There was recently in the Diosphere a book club with a book by Wendell Berry. Was that the first Wendell Berry book that you had read, or had you been familiar with him before? He is part of your native state or your adopted
My
state.
adopted state, yeah. No, I had read was it Sex Economy, Community and
Okay.
Freedom? Is that the title? I had actually taught, there's an essay in there, The Joys of Sales Resistance, and there's another one called Why I'm Not Getting a Computer. And at one point, I worked those into high school lesson plans with sophomores because I was trying to like make the point to them that like they can do things without the use of a computer. And Brother Wendell is going to show them how it's done. And that essay is so crotchety. I love it. It's like a dude stamping his foot many, many times, and he's right about it. And yet here we are on the internet, right? So I had read Wendell that one, and I'd also enjoyed the essay about the problems with tobacco because this is a tobacco state, and I moved in here and I didn't really know it, and so as an amateur Kentuckian, I wanted to learn like why do people farm this way around here, and like what are the traditions? How do people feed themselves? Just because I was curious.
Yeah.
So this is the longest Wendell book I've read, and I haven't read any of his fiction.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So, and the reason I bring him up, this comes out especially in his fictions. If you're so inclined, I would recommend some of his fiction as well. But he tells a story that's pretty common throughout a lot of his work of what he saw as social relationships breaking down, especially after World War II, due to the onset of basically industrialization, and especially industrial agriculture, and community ties being frayed and eventually breaking, and entering a world of placelessness. Um, in what ways? I guess I don't know. What do you share? Uh, kind of his narrative there? And if so, do you see narrative exchange as trying to, stitch those back together? Or I guess, how do you relate to Wendell Berry's work broadly in terms of the work you're doing?
Yeah, the man, the chapters on I learned so much from that book, particularly the chapters on ante and postbellum Kentucky with regards to like agrarianism and localism and how the demographics of the state shifted and the like it made me appreciate the fact that like it must have been really really hard to live in a place that balkanized, and actually like that was doom fuel for me too because that kind of balkanization is like if there's a civil war in America, that's the form it'll take. It'll be balkanized. It won't be like one team fights another one across geographic lines. That would be far too tidy, for the way that we deal with each other. So, like, in some ways, it reinforced, like, oh, this has happened before and it could happen again. And, like, that's the doom. So, like, if Wendell Berry is the patron saint of doom or optimism, like, that's a pillar right there. Um, I think that his lament about people becoming placeless is true, or I think it's if a lament can be true. I think that his complaint is it holds water and it's fair and it's correct. But the optimism that I see is that when you welcome a new neighbor to a place,
Yeah.
they do become part of that place, and even if they're not quote unquote from a place. As he kind of alluded to, the fact that like white people came to Kentucky at one point, and like there were people here before us. So like none of us are really from here. If the scale of your history goes back far enough. Um, so if you can de-emphasize the quote unquote authenticity of a person's relationship to a place, it's more maybe about like behaving right in the future. It's more about your the relationship you form with the place and with the people who live there. So like to your point earlier about like rural gentrification, like it's possible to move to the country and not be a bad neighbor. People do it all the time, but it's definitely prevalent for people to move to the country and be a bad neighbor, and that's the thing that he seems to object to. Like the idea of being a carpetbagger, wherever that puts you. That's being a bad neighbor, essentially. So I think that he really eloquently stitched together like all these things, and like that's the doom. But it's possible to move someplace and get close to people and learn from them. I have so many great examples of that, like in my own life, that I've been really fortunate and blessed with. A neighbor who is a friend who I met by being a farmer's market vendor showed up at my house one day with a trailer on his truck, and he had a brooder that he built for chickens because
Yeah.
he knew I was going to order some chicks, and he knew that I didn't know what the hell I was doing. And he and his wife showed up on a really hot day and dragged this thing out and put it in my greenhouse. because he knew that I'd never raised birds before and he didn't want me to fail. Um, and that was like, he didn't have to do that, but like he's teaching me how to farm because he saw me as a neighbor, and he's almost like, well, you're trying to do this, let me help you suck less.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think that that comes up a lot in conversations that I have. Is that it's not for some people it is, but for a lot of people it's not so much whether you're an outsider who's moved in, but it is really what you're bringing to the table. And in a lot of places, especially like in Southern Appalachia, there's a long history of kind of speculators, I guess you could say, coming in to figure out, often buying large tracts of land sight unseen because they want to figure out which resources they can extract and send to various markets, right? And I'm reading a book right now on the environmental history of Southern Appalachia. Going back to the 1500s, so starting with the Mississippians and the Cherokees and Spanish, and then the English and Scots Irish and all of this, and then beyond that, and it's just the history is just after we pass the kind of the settler phase, which was problematic for a whole variety of reasons, which we get into, but it's kind of like one history after another of basically big money speculators coming in for the deforestation to take the timber, or building the dams, right, and flooding whole communities. Thousands, tens of thousands of people getting flooded out. The copper, the iron mining, the coal mining, issues associated with that. And now, you hear people talk about like the Californians or the Floridians, right, or even the Texans coming in, you know, buying up large tracts of land for mountain cabins and basically real estate speculation, things of that nature,
Mhm.
and still pushing out local families and stuff. And so there's definitely that's a huge part of it. But it's interesting. I was just talking with a guy yesterday, a local guy who does my hay, and I don't know exactly what he thinks of me. He knows I'm a newcomer. We're friendly with each other, but we were having conversations, and and it was lovely. And but my impression is that people are pretty good about judging you for your character, right? And is this person uh, respectful of this place, and want to be helpful, and want to contribute to the community? Then it's not such a big deal that you're from the outside. Of course, again, there's laments about many of their children leaving, right? Like deciding after they inherit the land that's been in the families for a few hundred years, basically selling it and moving to the city or something, right? And so there's this kind of thing of like, our culture is dying, our kids are leaving, our traditions aren't being passed on. Um, and that's very sad. But then there's new people coming in, and some of them, you know, we don't like their intentions, especially around money. But then other people, okay, let's give them a shot, right? We'll see how they do for a few years, and see if we can get along with them, kind of thing. And that seems to be kind of a pattern I've noticed, which is, I think, a hopeful pattern, right? Like if you end up in a place that's you're not from, for whatever variety of reasons, you know, there is, I think, hope for you to not be a carpetbagger, and to be sincere. And you might never be accepted into certain aspects of the culture, but you'll help co-create a new kind of culture as well. Um, but it does depend on what your intentions are, and whether you have a kind of a regenerative attitude or an extractive attitude.
Yeah, yeah, I would feel, and that all of that stuff applies to me, and that this is a place that's I wasn't born here and raised here, and even if I did move back to where I was born and raised, like I would be an outsider if I've lived away for a few decades, because I think at this point in American culture, there's been so many decades of people kind of like splitting up and moving around, that there probably are really few pockets where people can say that they go way back on the land, generations deep. I think it's easier if you say, "Oh, I'm like a X generation Kentuckian or whatever." But as long as you define your locale as being a really big place, but like if you're going to gatekeep people who are like moving into a particular holler, like that's going to be a real small select group of people who are like quote unquote allowed to be there. Um, and yeah, your point about extraction versus like community is really that's really central to it. I think like it goes back to the doomer optimism thing about being a good neighbor. Um, if you can move into a place and be a good neighbor, other people can be a good neighbor to you, and in that way, you get to be part of a place like authentically. And that means learning how stuff is done and bringing your own little stuff with you. You know.
Yeah. 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 No, it's interesting. So I've been at this place, I'm in kind of rural Western North Carolina, about 10 miles from University Town, for about 4 years. And again, I have no idea what my neighbors really think of me. But everyone's very friendly, which is nice. I get good feelings from my interactions with neighbors and the locals, you could say. And I mean, there is a strong here, a strong culture of kind of be helpful, of being very helpful, but also minding your own business as well. Like, very, very strong kind of property rights, like, you don't mess with people's operations kind of thing. You don't, if you're gonna criticize it, you do it in the most kind of tangential, kind of subtle way imaginable, right? Because the way I'm doing my garden, the way I'm managing this land is pretty different than all my neighbors do. And I haven't heard any complaints about it, at least in my ear. So it's interesting. It's an interesting. Uh, Now I'm just kind of rambling, but my 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 son is entering kindergarten this year, and there's been a lot of debates online about private school versus public school, and we both know that Neil in Maine, has a lot of very strong opinions, but one of them that kind of cuts counter to to kind of that whole sphere is that he's very pro public school, uh,
Hmm.
because he doesn't think that kids should be isolated from each other, that they should have to interact with each other, and it's good for them. And I've kind of, I don't know, I think I've adopted that attitude. At least I'm going to try it. Like, I really want to make public school work. Partially because I've heard it's not bad here. Like
Hmm.
other people that we trust have said that, but also, unless you're part of a church, like a Baptist church here, which I'm not, then the public school really is the other heart of the community, right?
Hmm.
So if we want any chance of like building building stronger relationships here and developing a sense of community, that's going to be the way it happens.
Yeah, that's
You're a
co-sign
former
it.
public schools teacher, so I'm sure you have some pretty strong opinions on that as well.
Oh yeah, it's one of the easiest. It's one of my easiest buttons to push. So for listeners probably wouldn't be aware of this. This is sort of like Kentucky inside baseball, but like a few years ago we had a governor whom nobody likes, and he immediately picked a fight with school teachers to try to like kneecap the meager retirement that is afforded to us here. And so the blowback from that was immediate and pretty severe in that we had a wildcat strike. Well, we all got sick on the same day. I mean, it could happen to anyone, right? We all
Yeah,
got sick on the same day and happened to show up at the Capitol a few times.
yeah,
And um, the people that I met in that episode, I have, over the 5 or so years since that stuff has happened, have proven to me to be the most trustworthy, ride or die, steadfast people in terms of like serving kids. And we fight viciously for so many reasons about so many things. But when somebody comes for kids, everybody drops what they're doing and circles up. And another thing about Kentucky that's kind of topical here is that we don't quite yet have charter schools. There's been and like my org doesn't take a position on any of this stuff. Like I'm happy to work with any kids anywhere. I should say that, but we don't yet have that, right? There's this kind of social experiment that we were gonna do, charters here. And when I was in a rural town on Wednesday, um, the people who didn't even work for the school mentioned that, and they were like it was very distasteful to them because they see the public school as a cornerstone of their town. And I think like if you don't have a religious monoculture, then the place where you send your children is the heart of your community.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, I think like it's kind of a trope to say, oh, everything that is the government's is bad, which is like real simplistic thinking because a lot of things function just fine. But like if we trust our kids to a form of local government that is a school board and we vote on that at like the neighborhood level, then it's kind of our responsibility to make it go.
Yeah.
So I want every parent to get super involved in their kids' school and volunteer in whatever capacity they can. And I think that organizations that strengthen ties between parents and teachers, that is the way that a community circles up together and chooses on how to care for its young. Um, and there's no inherent like right answer to how that's done, right? Like there's no politically correct way that that ought to be. It's just that as long as everybody is caring for all the children under their roof, they're going to do right.
Yeah. And did you find when kind of people dropped what they're doing and circled up for, for the kids, did you find that the people were otherwise kind of ideologically diverse? Like were there what you would
Big time.
describe as more conservative or more progressive or
Yeah,
whatever?
oh, absolutely.
That was a
The
shared underlying sentiment.
yeah, the underlying sentiment is these are everyone's kids and they're our responsibility. And I don't care how you vote, but if I know that you're on my team about this one particular problem, then we can iron out the rest. And in a sense, to go back to the whole like overarching theme about narrative, is that we saw ourselves at an inflection point in a story, right? And every family has a story of its raising children. Every family that has kids, right, has a story of how they have their kids and then they get a little bit older and you make choices about their education and there's inflection points in your own story and those stories all kind of intersected at this one flashpoint. um, and I think that there's to draw that line a little bit further out into the present. The current or recent controversy over things like curriculum and CRT and the book banning and stuff like that. That is I think Wendell Berry would probably diagnose that as people diverging and not knowing each other anymore. And a quick example would be like this. There's a student in my class asked me what we were going to read one year. And one year I taught a Toni Morrison novel and got zero parent phone calls over it. It was just not a problem.
Yeah.
And this was with advanced students in 10th grade. They were brilliant. They handled the challenging aspects of the bluest eye magnificently. The next year, a student asked me what we were going to read, and I mentioned that as being a title I was thinking of because I wasn't certain if I would do it yet. And I got a really threatening parent phone call after it, like, does your principal know you're doing this? And the probably the most ridiculous part about it was that this mom thought that I wanted to teach teenagers about sex using sexual assault as the subject matter. And that was when I knew the conversation wasn't going to be serious because if you could think that somebody who has kept your kid for 180 hours a year would think that that was okay, then you're not really being serious. And what we're seeing now with these like really hot flashpoints is people genuinely not being serious about adults who are well-meaning and who want to care for their children as members of a little society. And we can disagree about what direction the society takes, but we get the kids we get, and we can't throw any of them away. And they all have value. So for people to kind of like show up and exercise veto power about what children are allowed to comprehend in school, um, I think it's a poverty because it's people choosing for others
Yeah.
who they think gets to belong. And it's basically telling people, okay, we were all in a story together, but you are no longer characters in this story. You are unwelcome characters, or worse, you are antagonists because antagonists are enemies, or they can be enemies, and you have to fight them. And so I think that that's one of those places where we came together and then we diverged over something and we have failed to kind of stitch that back up.
Okay. Well, at the risk of alienating at least half of our audience, let's talk about homeschooling. What you think about the homeschooling movement? Do you think that, like, do you empathize with parents in certain school districts that just say, like, I can't send my kid to public school for this, that, or the other reason? I need to protect my kids from certain aspects of society or other students, or I just need to give them a better education than they could get at a public school. We've had whole episodes on homeschooling in this podcast, and so I'd warn you to tread lightly, but I don't mind. I don't mind ruffling feathers either. So I'm curious. Give us your riff on what you think about homeschooling and the reasons why people do it and what it says about our society.
Oh yeah, great topic. And no, I'm not going to go out of my way to ruffle. I don't usually have to go out of my way to make people mad. I'm good at it, but um, I'm gonna try to avoid doing that because I think that's an issue that people are really precious about. And I think it would be surprising maybe to know as big of a public school stan as I am, for a short time during the pandemic, we chose to homeschool my son for reasons I can cover. So I completely empathize with everybody having diverse takes on the quality of schooling in their communities. That's a completely fair line of reasoning for every parent everywhere, and everybody should think about it. In Kentucky, the topic of quote unquote school choice is very hot right now, and you already have the choice. If you wish to enroll your child in a private school, you may do that, right? Like everybody has the right. If you wish to withdraw your child and school them at home, you have the right to do it. I think that some people have varying degrees of success with it. Some people are not temperamentally suited to do it. Some people genuinely don't know enough to teach a kid past fourth grade. I've seen this happen firsthand. But you know what? They're not my kids. So as long as they're not being like harmed, I don't really get to have a say in that. You know, um, I do think it's great when the most number of people possible can choose to put their kids in the same school because, like for Neil's same reasons, having a school that teaches the whole cross section of a community reinforces that community. So the school at which I taught is the only high school in town except for a small one. So it has everybody from kids in very wealthy areas to kids from really poor neighborhoods of all colors, right, and religious proclivities. We have everything in this one high school, and that was one of my favorite things about it because good, bad, and ugly, it's all in one place. And if we see social problems in the school, it's a reasonable guess that they are replicating problems which exist in the community. And if we can do a good job of creating community among teenagers, then when they grow up and they become my neighbors, they're good neighbors. I used to register kids to vote all the time. I don't care which box they check on the party thing. I'm just glad that they show up. So with homeschooling, there are perfectly legitimate reasons why people would choose to exit the system. And although it's everybody wants school to be better, your kid only gets to be in kindergarten once if you're lucky. So it's rational that people would say, I want this to be better, but it's not for me. Um, as far as the quality of instruction and stuff like that, that's such a wildly divergent topic. There are some people who do an amazing job, but now I'll explain why I homeschooled my child for a short time.
Mm.
My son is a little bit on the spectrum, um, in a way that maybe would be obvious to some strangers, but maybe not to others, right? He's 10. He's my elder. He's my only boy. And when the pandemic happened and I was teaching remotely, um, he had this like camera shyness of not wanting to get on a Zoom. They weren't even doing Zoom first grade, right? But we learned right away that like the remote schooling model that we attempted to implement in short order like wasn't right for him. And so we kind of just like on a wing and a prayer assembled a patchwork of things that we could do for my son that would keep him busy and learning that weren't just watching YouTube all day. And it sucked and we weren't great at it, but it was the best we could do in a short order. Now, when we could re-enroll him in school, we did at first opportunity because being that he is on the spectrum and he has some different needs that I'm not a qualified special ed teacher for young kids. I saw these needs and I said, I'm not qualified to fix these problems. He needs more people than we have. And so really I was thinking about the school as an extension of the community that I needed more people to help my family. I needed the whole village to help my child. And so now he's been back in school for several years, he's thriving, he's doing great. But whenever I get in touch with one of his teachers, whether it's the special ed or the generalists, I'm really clear that like I'm actively seeking their feedback, and I want to know like where they can see areas of improvement, and I'm here to support them as the home team all the time. But I needed more people, and I needed the school.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think it's important, and this doesn't have to be through a public school or, but I think it's important for kids to have other adult authorities in their lives. I noticed this a lot when our 5-year-old started t-ball this spring, and the way that the male coach, young fit guy who does is in the softball league, and very very good friendly guy, like the way he gave him instruction and the way my son responded to that instruction was something that was very good. That it's like, okay, it's good that he has another male figure, of authority in his life that he respects, right? I just think, I mean, that is our ancestral history. Again, our ancestors are, going way back, didn't have public school. It was a more informal community thing, and maybe we need to move back to that in various ways. And maybe just to, if any feathers are ruffled, maybe homeschooling networks and cooperatives will slowly, prefigure, an emergent new, form of the old village, so to speak. Maybe,
Yeah.
but in the meantime, kids do need to be around other adults. They do need to be around a wide diversity of people and different social situations and contexts. Like, I don't want to shelter my kid too much. I want to prevent them from harm and
Mhm.
trauma as much as I can, but like they need to be in different various settings, and having some of their touch points sometimes, like, oh, my parents aren't here, there's these other people here, how do I deal with the situation? I just think that's very good for character development, and that's just my own intuition. It's not, I haven't read any of the studies or anything.
Yeah, I don't think you need to read. I don't think that you need to apply science to all aspects of life. And one thing I will say, like, there's this may ruffle people's feathers, right? But like, your children are not livestock, and although the law treats them almost as like you do have the absolute authority over them, there are situations where, like in public school, as a mandated reporter, we witnessed or we found the signs of things like abuse and neglect. And of course, like nobody who's homeschooling, nobody who's like, assembling this gigantic curriculum and building a whole co-op, like there's nothing nefarious about that, obviously, but there were people who like would homeschool their kids because all you have to do is send in a letter, and that would hide signs of abuse and neglect, because if nobody from the state ever interacts with your child, like there's no one to report. So it's kind of like um, it would be possible to use that structure to get away with doing crimes, and some of those crimes involve kids, and that's a reality of public schooling, where you occasionally do intersect with the seedy underbelly of society that does not care for their kids the same way that you do. But I'm not impugning anybody who's choosing to homeschool. Like, I'm not painting them with that same brush. I'm just saying it exists as a facet of that structure. And as a person who had to be a mandated reporter and like report stuff, you know, those adults don't think they're doing wrong when they're abusing their children. Like, so there's a values conflict of like an adult as a state authority is stepping over a
yeah,
parent's rights on their kids, and that is what people get their feathers ruffled over.
yeah,
But it's real. Like, it's I just can't help the fact that it does exist and it's out there. And so if those kids never intersect with like the broader world, then like the chances of their situation improving is lessened.
yeah. I mean, I guess the deeper philosophical issue for me is, so it makes sense that the community would be partially responsible for the kids, and if the parents were abusing the kids or something, like other aspects of the community would jump in. I think where people take issue is this expectation that it's the state that's going to do that, and does it have to be the state, or can it be other aspects of civil society? Whether it's a religious community or neighbors or something else. And I think that's a very difficult, deep issue. That if the civil society has been hollowed out in many places, it has for very kind of macro historical economic reasons, then you almost need a state in some cases to do that. But it's almost, to me, a sign of failure of a society that it requires a state to, you know, uh, not to use a cliche, but to nanny the population, right? That seems like a
Mhm.
sign of failure of a society, rather than, even though it may be a necessity.
Yeah, totally. I'm not like out here like rooting for the state just to exist as this like giant, like omnipotent authority or whatever. It's just that like if somebody's putting cigarettes out on their kids, like they should face consequences for that. And like maybe the church pastor is not the person to be dispensing those consequences. And in communities like we've mentioned Appalachia a lot, and I've been in Louisville, which you could use that as a shorthand for like quote unquote urban society or whatever. There's a kind of a long tradition of people taking in kids for cousins and siblings, right? There's a lot of people in around here who are raising their sister's kids or they're raising their children's kids because of things like addiction or economics or other factors, and in that sense like families are backstopping what their members can't provide, and that doesn't require the state's intervention. It only requires that like when somebody's doing harm actively. So yeah, I think people broadly have the right to choose like what's good for their families, and to circle around to the like the the topic of the call as far as like narrative exchange, right? Like um, having children from any educational environment meet kids from any other educational environment is usually good. Kids from a homeschool co-op in Northern California could have plenty of things to talk about with kids from a public school in Kentucky, as long as we choose the right topics to talk about. And it doesn't have to be that we're solving the world's problems through narrative exchange. It's really just about the human in me is seeing the human in you,
Mm.
and we have to model that for kids. And so doing this in that kind of like slightly structured way gives people like a practice of how to meet people and find themselves in someone else's story.
Yeah. Nice. Okay. Well, I guess we should wrap up in a bit. And I think that was also a nice pitch for narrative exchange. But do you have any final words or any final topics that you want to discuss?
And I just want to see peace break out. As that's the hippiest, bleeding hardest thing about me. Is that the one of the blessings of doing this work for me is that I get to intentionally seek out and appreciate the differences between all sorts of people. And every time I learn about some new wrinkle of some people that I don't even know, it makes my life better. And it just broadens my world. So, like, even though I now work at home and I see fewer people on the daily basis than when I was a teacher, I have this real privilege to be blessed with like intersecting with lots of different people and appreciating like who they are and how they live and where they live and what they do. And I think like I just want everybody to be able to experience that because it tends to clear away some of the noise about things that we might argue about on the internet, that those aren't really important problems when we get down in person and meet somebody and say like who are you really, and what do you value and why do you value it, and why should I care about the things that you care about.
Yeah.
So I think it's we use this metaphor all the time about like a fabric, but every time I get to add another thread, like it makes my life richer, and I just want everybody to have that.
Well, beautiful. I think we should leave it at that. I think that's a nice send off. So thank you, Evan. This was nice. It's nice to get to know you a little bit better. Um, and this should be coming out in like a week or two, I think. So
Great. Well, I mean, if anybody wants to visit narrative4.com, you can join a story exchange on Zoom with a guaranteed random batch of participants from anybody else who signs up, and talk about stuff that's in your heart.
so what's the contact again? Narrative
So it's
for
narrative4.com.
narrative4.com.
And you can there's an option on there to join a story exchange, and we conduct them on Zoom routinely. So people from all corners of the world can just pick a sign up for a time and join a story exchange. And they may be a tell any story kind of event where you tell a story about a book that changed your life, or a time you met an important person or something. You just get to share a little episode from your life.
Very cool. Well, I would definitely recommend people do that, especially if you feel like you're stuck and you need to step out of your comfort zone socially and be in a place where you can, a brave space, as you said. I think that it's probably good for all of us. So thanks again. Till next time, Evan. Take care.
Thank you.